What if everything you believed to be love was actually just fear? Robert spent years trapped in the past, believing that keeping everything untouched was the only way to honor his wife's memory. But in reality, he was only imprisoning himself. His mansion, his garden, his very life, all stuck in time, until something unexpected happened. A woman appeared, daring to challenge his grief. Emily didn't see a grave in that garden. She saw life. And little by little, she made Robert see that true love is not that which remains frozen, but that which allows itself to blossom again. But was he ready for that? The black car slid down the gravel road, cutting through the silence of the night. The lights of the mansion appeared on the horizon, bathing the imposing facade in golden hues. Robert gripped the steering wheel tightly. He hadn't crossed that gate in years, and now that he was back, he felt the invisible weight of time and memories. When he got out of the car, the air filled with the scent of flowers hit him. He frowned. There shouldn't be any perfume. His wife's garden was untouched, dead like her. "James!" he called out, not hiding his impatience. The butler appeared at the door, impeccable as ever, but there was something different about him. A subtle hesitation. "Yes, sir? Who moved the house? It's different, the smell." James sniffled, moistening his lips. "You must be smelling the garden, Mr. Robert." Robert turned abruptly. The garden. He walked over to the lounge window and looked out. There they were. Red roses in full bloom, vines twining through the arches, a vibrant color where before there were only dried leaves and twisted branches. The silence was replaced by firm, determined steps. He crossed the hall and opened the doors, leading to the courtyard, feeling the warm night air envelop his skin. Each step was a blow against his logic. The garden should be as he left it, untouchable. Then he saw her, kneeling next to a rosebush. A young woman with dirt-stained hands was delicately plucking dried leaves. Her posture was calm, as if she were looking after something precious. The soft glow of the lanterns highlighted her firm features and the tranquility in her brown eyes. "Who are you?" Robert's voice cut through the air. The woman lifted her face unhurriedly. He noticed that she didn't seem surprised by his presence. "Emily, sir. I look after the garden." He narrowed his eyes. "Who hired you?" "You've been away for a long time. The garden needed tending." Robert felt a bitter taste in his mouth. The word absent sounded like an accusation. "No one has the right to touch this garden." Emily stood up, wiping her hands on her skirt. He was dying. He couldn't stay like this. Robert's chest rose and fell, anger rising like wildfire. "You don't understand. This garden belongs to someone." Emily didn't look away. And that person wouldn't want it to die. Her audacity disarmed him for a moment. Nobody talked to him like that. "I want everything to go back to the way it was, tomorrow." Emily took a deep breath, crossing her arms. "That would be a mistake, sir." Robert turned abruptly, without looking back. When he entered the mansion, one detail disturbed him more than anything else. Emily's voice was not one of defiance, but of certainty. He hated to admit it, but it bothered him more than it should have. The sun had not yet risen when Robert came downstairs. The silence in the house seemed heavier than usual. He grabbed a cup of coffee and walked over to the glass door that overlooked the garden. He stood there, observing the landscape in the dim light of dawn. The colors of the flowers were soft, the dew glistened on the petals, and the fresh smell of freshly turned earth filled the air. "This has to stop," he thought. He opened the door and stepped outside. The cold morning air enveloped him, but what really caught his attention was the sound of the earth being stirred. Emily was already there. She was kneeling by the rose bushes, her fingers sunk into the earth, working with a delicacy that irritated him. As if that place was hers, as if she had a right to be there. She looked up when she noticed him, but showed no surprise. "Good morning, Mr. Robert." He crossed his arms. "I don't remember allowing you to stay here." Emily continued pulling some weeds with her firm, experienced hands. "I also don't remember you telling me I was fired." The calm, almost casual tone made Robert's blood boil. "I demanded that everything go back to the way it was before." Emily sighed and stood up slowly, wiping the dirt from her hands. "And why?" Robert narrowed his eyes. "What do you mean, why? Why do you want everything to go back to the way it was?" "Because this garden belongs to my wife." "Your wife is dead." Robert felt his stomach turn. "I know that." Emily tilted her head slightly. "Then why do you keep this garden as a tomb?" The impact of her words was immediate. He took a step forward, his gaze turning cold. "You don't know anything about my wife." Emily held his gaze. I know she loved this garden. I know that she devoted time and care to each plant. And I know that people who love flowers wouldn't want to see them die." Robert was silent for a moment. The wind blew, carrying the scent of the newly opened roses. He hated to admit it, but something inside him reacted to this scent. It was familiar, and at the same time, new. "What's in it for you?" he asked, crossing his arms. Emily smiled slightly. "A living garden, and perhaps a less dead owner." He laughed humorlessly. "Do you really think you can change me?" Emily shrugged. "I don't need to change you, Mr. Robert. I just need you to realize that you're already changing." Robert felt a twinge of discomfort. The way she said it, with such conviction, irritated him more than anything. "This garden doesn't need you." "No? Then why are you here now?" He didn't know what to say. The most obvious answer was that he was there to make sure Emily wasn't ruining everything. But deep down, he knew that wasn't all. He turned to leave, but hesitated for a brief moment. Then, without looking back, he walked back to the mansion. Emily went back to work without another word, as if she already knew he was coming back. And he did. Over the next few days, Robert found himself going into the garden without realizing it. At first, it was to observe, to supervise what Emily was doing. But little by little, he began to notice the details, the way the leaves glistened in the sun, the delicacy with which the petals opened, the soft sounds of bees buzzing among the flowers. One particularly cold afternoon, he found himself sitting on one of the stone benches. Emily was working quietly, without making a point of starting a conversation. But this time, it was Robert who broke the silence. "Do you like doing this?" Emily looked up and smiled slightly. "Yes. I think every garden has a story." He frowned. "Story? Yes. A garden reflects its owner. It shows what is alive and what is stagnant. Have you ever stopped to think about what your garden says about you?" Robert felt discomfort growing inside him. He stood up abruptly. "I don't need to think about it." Emily said nothing. She just went back to work, as patiently as ever. That night, Robert couldn't sleep. He tossed and turned in bed, but every time he closed his eyes, images of Catherine appeared in his mind. And for the first time, instead of seeing her motionless like a shadow from the past, he imagined her walking through the garden, alive, among the flowers. This thought kept him awake until dawn. Robert woke up with the sky still dark. The sheets were tangled around him and the pillow seemed harder than usual. He rubbed his face and sat up in bed. There was no point in trying to sleep anymore. He put on a robe and went downstairs. The silence in the house was absolute. But inside, a noise persisted, a nuisance that refused to be ignored. He walked to the kitchen and made himself a cup of coffee. But before he could even take the first sip, his feet guided him to the glass door leading out into the garden. When he opened the door and stepped outside, he felt the fresh morning air against his skin. The smell of wet earth and freshly raked leaves filled his senses, and then there she was. Emily was working among the rose bushes, her hands dirty with earth. Her hair, tied up in a loose bun, let a few strands escape, swaying in the wind. She seemed completely immersed in what she was doing, as if she were taking care of something precious. He stood there, watching. "You should get more sleep," said Emily, without even raising her face. Robert frowned. "Do you always meddle in other people's lives like that?" Emily smiled. "Only when I see someone fighting about things that were decided a long time ago." He crossed his arms, suspicious. "Decided by whom?" "Time itself." Robert snorted. "You talk as if you know everything." Emily put down the shovel and wiped her hands on her skirt. "I don't know everything, Mr. Robert, but I do know that holding something dead won't bring it back to life." He narrowed his eyes. "What exactly do you mean by that?" She turned to him, facing him squarely. "You've been standing in the same place for years, but time hasn't stopped. The garden knows that. It needs to grow. So do you." Anger grew inside him. "I don't need lessons from a gardener." Emily sighed and pointed to a rosebush next to them. "Look at this rose." Robert looked at the flower without patience. "What's wrong with it?" "It was pruned a few months ago. Its leaves had withered and the stem looked dry. But look at it now." Robert watched in silence. The once fragile rose now displayed vibrant red petals as if it had never suffered. "I could have plucked it, Mr. Robert, but I knew it still had life in it." He swallowed. "And you think I'm that rose?" Emily smiled. "I don't think you realize you're still alive." Robert's chest rose and fell, heavy. "You don't understand anything about me." "Maybe not," she admitted. "But I do understand gardens. And I know that even the oldest of trees can bloom again." Robert looked away and turned around, heading back into the house. But unlike the previous days, he wasn't running away. He was thinking. Over the next few days, he kept returning to the garden. At first, just to supervise, then to observe, and without realizing it, he began to sit on the stone benches, listening to Emily talk about the plants, the roots, the way each leaf carried its own story. One afternoon, he broke the silence. "Do you like doing this?" Emily looked at him and smiled. "Yes, I believe that every garden has a story." He frowned. "Story?" "Yes. A garden reflects its owner. It shows what is alive and what is stagnant. Have you ever stopped to think about what your garden says about you?" Robert felt discomfort growing inside him. He stood up, abruptly. "I don't need to think about it." Emily just went back to work, without insisting. But that night, Robert couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Catherine among the flowers. Only this time, she wasn't standing still, frozen in time. She was walking, she was smiling, and for the first time, Robert didn't know if it was just a dream or the start of something new. Fine rain fell throughout the night, and when Robert woke up, the sky was still covered in thick clouds. The mansion seemed quieter than ever. He sat up in bed, his eyes fixed on the picture frame on the bedside table. Catherine was smiling in the picture, holding a white rose picked from the garden. For years he had looked at that picture as if it were an untouchable piece of the past, but now something was different. He put on a coat and went downstairs, his footsteps echoing across the marble floor. When she reached the glass door leading to the garden, she hesitated for a moment before opening it. The humidity in the air brought a fresh scent of wet earth and rain-washed leaves. The garden seemed more alive, more vibrant. The drops running down the rose petals reflected the dim light of dawn. And then he saw her. Emily was there, kneeling among the rose bushes, her hands dirty with mud. "You're beginning to see, aren't you?" she said without turning around. Robert didn't reply immediately. He walked slowly to a nearby stone bench and sat down, his eyes fixed on the flowers. "I don't know what you're talking about," he muttered. Emily sighed, wiping her hands on her skirt before looking up at him. "Of course you do. You just don't want to admit it." Robert ran a hand over his face, exhausted. "What do you want from me?" She smiled slightly. "Nothing, but I think this garden wants something from you." He frowned. "What do you mean?" Emily looked around, pointing at the flowers that had been restored. The plants were dying, the roots were suffocated. "But do you want to know what was hardest to fix?" Robert didn't answer. "The soil," she continued. "It was hard, dry. In order for these flowers to grow again, I had to break it up." He crossed his arms, feeling uncomfortable. "And what does that have to do with me?" Emily smiled sideways. "Everything." Robert took a deep breath. "My wife loved this garden. And do you think she would have liked to see it as it was?" Robert looked away. I don't know." Emily stood up and walked over to him, stopping a few steps away. "Then why are you so afraid to let him live?" He clenched his fists. "It's not about fear. Then what is it about?" Robert opened his mouth to answer, but no words came out. Emily sighed and looked up at the sky, watching the fine rain that was still falling. "Do you know what I like about rain?" He arched an eyebrow. "What's that?" "After it passes, everything looks cleaner." Robert looked around. The wet leaves glistened, and the smell of damp earth brought a strangely comforting sensation. For years he had avoided this garden. He had refused to look at it, but now there was something different, something he couldn't ignore. He stood up abruptly. "I need to go." Emily nodded, without trying to stop him. "Go then, but come back when you're ready to see." Robert turned and walked into the mansion. But unlike the other times, he knew he wasn't running away. He was thinking. That night he dreamt of Catherine. She was in the garden among the flowers, but unlike his usual memories, she wasn't still, frozen in time. She was smiling, and for the first time, Robert woke up feeling nothing but pain. The day dawned with a sky full of dark clouds. A cold wind cut through the air, and the mansion seemed even quieter than usual. Robert watched the garden from his office window, his thoughts confused. Since his return, this had been his routine, to observe from afar without allowing himself to get involved. But something inside him had changed. He couldn't explain exactly what, but he felt it. Then thunder rumbled in the distance. The rain began as a fine drizzle, but quickly turned into a storm. The trees swayed violently, and the bushes bent under the weight of the wind. It was then that Robert saw Emily. She was in the middle of the garden, struggling against the force of the storm, trying to protect the most fragile plants. He felt his body move before he could even think. He hurried down the stairs, opened the door, and ran outside. The wind whipped at his clothes and the rain wet his face, but he ignored it all. "Emily!" he shouted, trying to make himself heard above the roar of the wind. She turned around quickly, her wet hair sticking to her face. "What are you doing here?" she asked, shouting back. "The same as you," he replied, bending down to help her tie a wooden stake that held up a vine. Emily watched him for a moment, surprised. "I thought you wanted the garden to disappear." Robert pulled hard on the rope, steadying the plant in place before looking at her. "I don't want it to die." Emily cracked a small smile, even as the storm battered them. The wind grew even stronger. A branch broke and fell near them, making Emily cringe. "We need to get out of here," she shouted. "A little more," Robert insisted, protecting the last exposed flowers. When they finally finished, they both ran into the mansion, panting, their clothes soaked and their bodies trembling. Robert wiped his hands across his face, trying to catch his breath. Emily laughed softly. "I don't know what was more impressive," she said. "The storm, or the fact that you just saved a garden that you wanted to destroy." Robert looked at her and for the first time felt neither anger nor resistance, only acceptance. "I think maybe I made a mistake," Emily smiled. "Everyone does, but what's important is what we do afterwards." Robert nodded slowly, looking outside. The rain was starting to fall, and he noticed something curious. Despite the strength of the storm, most of the plants had held out, just like him. And for the first time in years, this idea didn't frighten him. Dawn brought clear skies and fresh air. The smell of wet earth still hung in the air, mingling with the scent of flowers freshly washed by the rain. Robert walked up to the glass door, hesitated for a moment, and then went out. The garden was different, not because of the storm, but because for the first time he was seeing it differently. Some of the leaves were torn, some of the petals had been ripped off by the wind, but most of the plants were still standing. They had resisted. Emily was kneeling in the middle of the flower bed, surveying the damage. "We need to prune a few branches, but nothing we can't recover," she said without looking at him. Robert approached slowly, his hands in his pockets. "I don't want it to go back to the way it was." Emily stopped what she was doing and looked at him. "Are you sure?" He took a deep breath, looking around. "I'm sure." Emily smiled and went back to tending to the plants. Robert stood there, watching her for a while. Then, without saying anything, he knelt down beside her and picked up one of the shovels. Emily arched an eyebrow in surprise. "Are you going to help me?" "I thought it was time to do something about the garden," he replied, with a slight smile. She laughed and nodded. "Welcome to hard work, Mr. Robert." And so, together they began to restore what had been damaged. As they worked, Robert realized something he had never noticed before. The garden wasn't just a place for memories. It was a place of growth. And for the first time in years, he allowed himself to grow along with it.